2 seconds before the moment that would split her life in two, Isabella Reyes stood at the entrance of a glittering New Year's gala, gold balloons bobbing above her like quiet verdicts. Her red waitress uniform felt too bright under the chandelier, and her hands trembled around a wrinkled envelope pressed tight to her chest. Across from her, Damian Blackwood turned toward her in a tailored blue suit, calm as polished stone, as if the noise of the party belonged to someone else. Behind him, laughter and crystal clinks floated through the air, warm and careless, while the city lights beyond the windows glittered like promises meant for strangers. Isabella drew a breath that scraped her throat, because midnight wasn't just a celebration tonight, it was a deadline. "I need a husband by New Year's Eve," she said, and the words looked small in a room this rich, but they carried a weight that bent her spine anyway. A few guests nearby slowed, sensing the shape of a scandal, and Isabella felt their attention crawl across her skin like cold fingertips. She tried to explain fast before courage could abandon her. There was a clause, a legal trap tied to her future, and if she failed by the turn of the clock, she would lose everything. Not money, not comfort, but the one person she loved enough to work herself raw for, the one life she refused to let slip away. Damian didn't smile, didn't mock, only watched the envelope as if it were a weapon someone had slipped into her hands. He held out his palm, steady and unquestioning, and Isabella handed the envelope over like a confession she couldn't swallow anymore. Damian unfolded it with the patience of a man who had read threats dressed as contracts before, his eyes moving line by line while the party glittered on behind him. Isabella searched his face for mercy and found none, only calculation, the kind that meant he was already mapping exits, risks, and names. Then his gaze stopped on a paragraph near the bottom, and something subtle shifted in his expression, a tightening at the jaw as if he recognized the handwriting more than the words. In that tiny pause, Isabella understood that her problem had just become bigger than her fear. Damian angled his body slightly, shielding her from the staring guests with the same effortless authority he used to command rooms. "There's more here than you were told," he said quietly, and the softness of his voice made the warning feel sharper. Isabella's stomach dropped, because she had come begging for survival, not for war, and yet Damian's eyes held the calm certainty of someone who didn't avoid battles. He ended them. He looked up at her then, not with pity, but with a cold kind of focus that made her heart beat wrong. And when he spoke his next words, Isabella realized midnight wasn't the only thing coming fast. It was the truth behind the trap, and the name of the person who set it. When Damian guided Isabella away from the doorway, the party didn't stop. It simply learned to pretend it hadn't noticed. Behind them, laughter resumed in thin, careful waves, and the clink of glasses returned like a curtain being pulled back into place. The hallway outside the ballroom was dimmer, quieter, smelling faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume that lingered in the air like a judgment. Gold light spilled through the cracked doorway in trembling stripes, painting Isabella's uniform in soft, humiliating highlights. She folded her hands together because the envelope was gone now, and without it her fear had nowhere to hide. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isabella could still feel the stares she'd left behind, as if they had followed her out and pressed themselves against her back. She tried to steady her breathing, but every inhale tasted of champagne sweetness and something sharper underneath. Panic, metallic and cold. Damian walked beside her without touching her, yet his presence felt like a barrier, the kind that didn't comfort but protected through sheer certainty. He wasn't gentle, but he was controlled, and that control was the only stable thing in a night that kept slipping. Isabella's heart beat in her throat, and she hated that she was grateful for his silence. She forced her voice to work again, careful with every word, as if the wrong sentence could snap the trap shut faster. The clause wasn't a rumor or a threat whispered in anger, she admitted. It was ink, notarized and weaponized, stitched into an arrangement meant to secure her future. Someone had tightened it recently, turning it from a safety net into a noose, and they had timed it for tonight, for the turn of the year when the world would be too distracted to notice one waitress being erased. If she failed the deadline, she wouldn't just lose money. She would lose rights, protections, the fragile stability she'd built for the one person who depended on her. While she spoke, Damian's eyes stayed steady, and the more she revealed, the more his calm began to look less like indifference and more like a man recognizing an old pattern. They stopped near a tall window where the city glittered outside, bright and distant, celebrating a midnight that meant freedom to everyone but her. Damian looked at the lights for a second, then back at Isabella, and the air shifted. Quiet, charged, almost inevitable. "You didn't come here to be dramatic," he said, his voice low enough to feel private. "You came because someone cornered you." Isabella's throat tightened at the truth of it, because being understood was almost as frightening as being judged. Then Damian's phone lit up in his hand, the screen showing an unknown number, and the smallest change crossed his face, an alertness that made Isabella's stomach drop. In that instant, she realized the trap wasn't waiting for midnight anymore, and whoever had built it was already reaching for her. Isabella's eyes stayed on Damian's lit screen for a beat too long, as if the glow could reveal who was hunting her. The unknown number rang once, twice, then stopped, like someone testing a door handle to see if it would turn. Damian didn't answer, but he didn't look surprised either, and that was what frightened her most. He slipped the phone away, with the same calm precision he'd used to unfold her envelope, as if every threat had its proper place in his pocket. In the pause that followed, Isabella felt the old truth rise in her chest. This wasn't random misfortune. It was someone's plan. Her mind fled backward to a life that had once been simple enough to trust. A small apartment that smelled like laundry soap and café con leche, a kitchen table with scratches that told stories of cheap meals and long nights, and mornings when the sunrise felt like a promise instead of a countdown. She remembered double shifts, tired feet, and the quiet pride of paying bills on time, even when it meant skipping everything that looked like joy. There had been laughter too, soft, private, the kind that lives in small homes where love does more work than money. Back then, she believed that if she just kept going, the world would eventually reward effort with peace. But peace had never been what the clause was designed to give her. It had arrived dressed like security, hidden inside paperwork tied to an inheritance arrangement that was supposed to protect her future. Someone had spoken to her about responsibility, about family legacy, about doing what was best, and she had signed because she was young and exhausted and trying to be grateful. Later she learned how power writes rules the way others write invitations, carelessly, confidently, assuming compliance. The clause had always been there, waiting like a trap beneath a clean floor, and all it needed was the right moment to snap shut. Tonight wasn't an accident. Tonight was timing. Isabella's fingers found the worn edge of a faded photo in her wallet, a small rectangle of warmth she carried like a shield. The person she loved, the one she'd been protecting, was not a romantic secret, not a dramatic confession for a glittering party, but a fragile piece of her life that could not survive another loss. That was why she had shown up in that hallway, trembling in her red uniform, willing to humiliate herself in front of strangers if it meant keeping one precious life safe. Her voice came out quieter now, rougher, as if memory had scraped it raw. "They filed something today," she admitted, and the words felt like stepping onto broken glass. Damian's gaze narrowed, and Isabella felt the floor tilt under her, because saying it out loud made it real in a new way. The clause hadn't simply activated, someone had triggered it with a sudden legal notice, rushed through with the kind of influence that bends systems without leaving fingerprints. She hadn't been warned, hadn't been given time. And that was the point, to force her into panic, to make her choose the fastest surrender. She swallowed, tasting fear again, and added the part she hadn't wanted to admit to anyone. "They know where I live," she whispered, and the city lights behind the glass seemed to sharpen, as if even the night had turned its attention toward her. Damian didn't ask follow-up questions the way most people did, circling around details out of politeness or panic. He asked one question like a blade laid flat on a table. "Who benefits if you fail at midnight?" The hallway felt suddenly narrower, the gold light from the ballroom thinning into stripes that didn't warm anything. Isabella's lips parted, but her pride fought her fear, because naming names felt dangerous and silence felt safer, even when it was killing her. Still, she had already come too far to protect anything with half-truths. She told him what she could, keeping her voice steady, the way she did with customers when her hands were shaking. There was a family with a spotless reputation in public and a private talent for cruelty. A family that wore charity like perfume and used lawyers like weapons. There was an attorney who moved faster than truth, whose letters were always polite, while his intentions were not. And there was a connection to her past she didn't like to say out loud, because it made her feel as if she was dragging dirt into a room full of marble. Damian listened without blinking, but when she mentioned the lawyer's name, something in his posture shifted, small, controlled and unmistakable, like a man recognizing a shadow he'd met before. Without explaining why, Damian guided her farther down the corridor, away from the ballroom doors and the curious eyes on the other side. He stopped near a quiet alcove where the music was only a distant pulse, and he spoke as if time itself belonged to him. "You need a husband by midnight," he said, repeating her words without mockery, turning them into a cold fact. "I can give you what the paper demands." Isabella's heart stuttered, because hearing it from him made it sound both possible and terrifying, like stepping onto a bridge you can't see the end of. Then he added the part that tightened her throat. "But it won't be free." The deal came in clean lines, the way everything in Damian's world seemed to come. A marriage arrangement on paper, strict rules, complete discretion, and public appearances that would shut the vultures up. Separate rooms, no emotional confusion, no impulsive promises, only strategy. Isabella felt anger rise with the fear, because she had worked too hard to become someone's convenient solution. She wanted to say no, to walk away, to keep her dignity even if she lost everything else. But the clock was already leaning toward midnight, and her life, her real life, the one that mattered, was balanced on that single ruthless condition. Damian's gaze moved past her shoulder for a fraction of a second, and Isabella followed it instinctively, sensing a presence even when she couldn't see it. Someone at the end of the hallway turned away too quickly, pretending to check their phone, and Isabella's stomach dropped as if the floor had opened beneath her. Damian's hand lifted, not to touch her, but to gesture once, subtle and precise, and a security guard near the ballroom shifted position like a chess piece, obeying a silent command. Then Damian looked back at Isabella, his voice lower now, edged with something that wasn't kindness, but wasn't cruelty either. "If they're already inside your life," he said, "then you don't need a romance, Isabella. You need protection." And in the next breath, he made a call that told her he had already started a war he wasn't planning to lose. Isabella expected Damian's call to summon a car, a lawyer, some quick fix that belonged to rich people, and stayed far away from girls in red uniforms. Instead, the call sounded like a signal, quiet, controlled, and sharp enough to make the hallway feel colder. He spoke in short phrases, names she didn't recognize, instructions that didn't need repeating, and when he ended it, He did so with the calm finality of a door locking. For a second, Isabella could only stare at him, hearing the party's music thudding behind the walls like a heart that didn't care. Then, as if the building itself had decided to remind her where she stood, a manager in a black suit appeared at the edge of the corridor. The man's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "Isabella," the manager murmured, glancing past her to Damian, "you're needed back inside." The words were soft, but the message was not. Stop being a problem. Isabella's cheeks burned because she knew what they were seeing. A waitress who dared to interrupt the glittering rhythm of the rich. Somewhere behind the manager, a guest leaned against the doorframe with a glass in hand, watching as if this were part of the entertainment. Isabella opened her mouth to apologize out of habit, out of survival, but Damian's voice cut through first, calm and perfectly placed. "She's with me," he said, and the manager's smile tightened, as if forced to accept a truth he hated. Damian turned back to Isabella and extended his hand again, not palm up this time, but in a gesture that felt like a decision being offered. "Give me the envelope for one more minute," he said. Isabella hesitated. She had already handed over her fear once tonight, but the look in his eyes told her he'd found something and wasn't done. She passed it over, and he read again, slower now, scanning not just the lines, but the spaces between them, the wording that could be twisted, the cruelty hidden in legal politeness. Isabella watched his jaw set harder, the first visible crack in his icy composure, and she knew it wasn't just the marriage deadline that bothered him. It was the intention behind it. Someone had written this to hurt her. He folded the papers with a careful precision that felt almost tender, though his face stayed unreadable. "This isn't standard," he said quietly. "There's a secondary condition embedded here. One that can be used to paint you as unstable, unfit, desperate." Isabella's stomach turned because she understood what that meant, even without knowing the full legal language. It wasn't only about forcing her to marry. It was about humiliating her, cornering her, making her look unworthy in public so they could take whatever they wanted in private. Damian's gaze lifted to hers, steady and hard, and for the first time she saw anger, not loud, not dramatic, but controlled like steel. "They didn't expect me to see this," he said, and the way the words fell made Isabella realize something that should have comforted her, but didn't. The people hunting her had just made an enemy out of the most dangerous man in the room. The ride to Damian Blackwood's place felt like slipping out of one world and into another without ever being asked if she was ready. Isabella sat in the back seat of a silent black car, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her red uniform a bright, stubborn stain against the dark leather. Streetlights passed over the windows in slow flashes, turning her reflection into a ghost that couldn't decide whether to be brave or afraid. Damian sat across from her, phone in hand, speaking quietly to someone she couldn't see, arranging things with the same calm he used to breathe. He never told her to relax, never offered empty reassurance. He only moved like a man who had already decided she would not be swallowed by tonight. When the penthouse doors opened, Isabella stepped into a space made of glass, pale stone, and expensive silence. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows, like a painting nobody touched, beautiful and indifferent. And for a moment she felt smaller than she had at the party. A woman in neat black clothing, house staff Isabella realized, greeted Damian with respectful familiarity, then glanced at Isabella with a softness that surprised her. Damian didn't introduce Isabella with a story or an apology. "She's staying here," he said, simple as a command, and the words landed in Isabella's chest with a strange mix of relief and humiliation. She hated that she needed anyone's shelter, even as her body clung to the safety it offered. Damian led her to a sitting area where everything looked too clean to be lived in, then laid out his terms, the way a judge reads a sentence. Separate rooms, public appearances if necessary. No sharing personal details with anyone outside the house. No improvisation. "This is a strategy, not a romance," he said, and his tone made it clear he wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a shield. Isabella's pride flared hot and sharp, because she had worked too hard to survive on dignity alone to become someone's arrangement. "I'm not a prop," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Damian's gaze didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. "Then don't act like one," he replied, and somehow that stung more than an insult. Isabella reached for her phone to call the person she loved, the one whose safety had dragged her into this night in the first place. The screen lit, the call connected for half a second, and then the line cut, again and again, as if an invisible hand kept pressing end. Her pulse spiked, the fear rushing back in a wave so strong it made her dizzy. Damian watched her try, and in that stillness she saw something pass through his eyes. Recognition, not of her, but of the tactic. "They're interfering," he said quietly, and it wasn't a guess. Isabella felt her throat tighten, because if they could reach into her calls, then they could reach into everything. And as the city glittered outside Damian's windows like it was celebrating her downfall, Isabella realized she hadn't just stepped into a rich man's home. She had stepped onto the front line of a war she didn't yet understand. Isabella didn't sleep. Not really. Not the way people sleep when they believe tomorrow belongs to them. In the guest room, the sheets were too soft, the silence too complete, and the city beyond the glass looked like a million tiny eyes refusing to blink. She sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands, watching the screen as if willpower could force the world to answer her. When a message finally appeared, it didn't come from the person she was trying to reach. It came from an unknown number, and the words made her blood turn cold. "Your apartment has been inspected. Removal begins immediately." The timestamp was recent enough to feel like a hand closing around her throat. She rushed into the hallway barefoot, her heart hammering, the red uniform folded over her arm like proof she still had a life outside these walls. Damian was already awake, dressed as if he had never been tired a day in his life, standing near the living room window with his phone to his ear. He ended the call the moment he saw her face. Isabella tried to speak, but only a broken sound came out at first, the kind a person makes when the world tips too fast. She thrust her phone toward him, and when he read the message, his calm didn't vanish, yet something in him tightened. A quiet violence held behind perfect control. "They moved," he said, and it wasn't surprise in his voice. It was confirmation. Damian spoke to his security team in clipped, efficient phrases, the kind that turned fear into action. Screens lit up in the living room, camera feeds, addresses, names, and Isabella realized he had systems in place for threats she couldn't even imagine. A guard's voice came through the speaker, confirming what she dreaded. Men in suits at her building, paperwork waved like permission, boxes being carried out as neighbors watched from behind curtains. Isabella's knees weakened because her apartment wasn't just a place. It was where she kept her memories, her documents, the small comforts that made hardship bearable, and the fragile line of stability she fought for every day. "They're taking everything," she whispered, and the sentence felt like surrender. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped her phone, and in her chest the terror sharpened into one unbearable thought. If they could erase her home, they could erase her future. That was when Isabella broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that sounded worse, because it was so small. "I can't lose them," she said, voice trembling, the truth spilling out through the cracks of her pride. "Not after everything." For a fraction of a second, Damian's mask slipped, just enough for her to see the cost of his control. An old ache, familiar and dangerous, the kind that comes from caring when caring can be used against you. He stepped closer, not touching her, but placing himself between her and the open room, as if he could block the world with his body. "No one touches what's yours," he said, low and absolute, and Isabella felt the promise settle over her like a heavy coat. Then Damian's legal advisor arrived sooner than seemed possible, carrying a slim folder and a face that looked too calm for the chaos unfolding. He laid 2 documents on the table. One was the copy of Isabella's clause, and the other was something newer, stamped and dated, filed with ruthless speed. The advisor pointed to a section Isabella had never seen before, a paragraph that didn't match the paper's formatting, as if it had been stitched in by someone with practiced hands. "This portion is inconsistent," the advisor said, voice even. "It reads like a forgery." Isabella's breath caught, because the word made the world shift. If parts of the clause were fake, then the real truth wasn't in her envelope at all. And as Damian's eyes narrowed over the mismatched lines, Isabella realized the worst possibility wasn't that she'd been trapped. It was that the real document, the one that could save her, was still out there, in someone else's hands. After the chaos settled into a tense, guarded quiet, Isabella found herself back in the guest room with a glass of water she didn't remember pouring. The penthouse was still too perfect, too silent, as if fear wasn't allowed to leave fingerprints on expensive surfaces. Outside the window, fireworks bloomed and vanished over the city, bright bursts of joy that lasted only seconds, long enough to remind her that other people were celebrating a new beginning. Isabella watched the colors fade into smoke and felt an ache spread through her chest, not envy, but grief for the life she'd fought to keep simple. She pressed her palm to her sternum, trying to steady a heart that didn't want to be steady anymore. She didn't pray the way people in movies prayed, loudly or dramatically, with perfect words. Her prayer was quieter, stitched together from exhaustion and love. "Please let me keep them safe. Please don't let them take what I can't replace. Please give me wisdom, not luck." The room smelled faintly of fresh linen, clean and unfamiliar, and she missed the scent of her own apartment, the coffee, the soap, the lived-in warmth that made hardship feel survivable. In her mind, she saw her belongings being boxed like they were meaningless, and the image twisted something inside her until her eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing tears, because tonight had already taken enough from her. Across the hall, Damian stood alone in his office, city light cutting sharp angles across his face. He had money, influence, power, but none of it could rewind what had been set in motion, and none of it could erase the fact that someone had targeted a young woman like she was disposable. He stared at the forged section the advisor had flagged, tracing the inconsistency with a finger, as if the paper itself might confess. This wasn't just legal cruelty, it was personal, the kind of move made by someone who wanted Isabella terrified and silent. Damian had seen tactics like this before, used against him, against people weaker than him, against anyone who didn't have the right name. And the older part of him, the part he rarely let breathe, whispered that caring was always the first step toward being hurt. When Isabella finally stepped into the doorway, wrapped in a borrowed robe, Damian looked up as if he'd been expecting her. Neither of them spoke at first, because some nights made words feel too fragile to carry the truth. Isabella's voice came out soft and rough, like she had walked through fire just to reach it. "I never wanted any of this," she said, and she didn't mean the penthouse or the party. She meant the fight, the humiliation, the way survival kept demanding more than she had. Damian's reply was just as quiet. "Neither did I," he admitted, and for a second his control didn't look like arrogance, it looked like armor. Isabella held his gaze, and the fear inside her shifted into something heavier, something more dangerous than panic, the knowledge that she now depended on him. Dependence was a chain, even when it came wrapped in safety, and she had spent her whole life trying not to be owned by anyone's decisions. Damian, as if reading the thought on her face, set the papers down, and spoke with a calm that didn't promise comfort, only truth. "If you stay near me," he said, "they'll come harder." Isabella's throat tightened because she already knew that. The only question left was whether protection was worth the price of stepping deeper into his world, and whether the man who shielded her tonight might one day be the one who broke her heart without even meaning to. Morning arrived without softness, the kind of morning that didn't bring relief but brought paperwork, calls, and consequences. Isabella stood in Damian's sleek kitchen, holding a mug of coffee she barely tasted, watching the steam rise as if it could carry her fear away. The city outside looked freshly washed by dawn, yet her chest still felt tight, like she was breathing through cloth. A kind housekeeper moved quietly around her, offering food the way you offer warmth, without questions, without judgment. Isabella wanted to say she didn't belong here, but the words wouldn't come out, because belonging wasn't what she needed right now. What she needed was time, and time was exactly what her enemies had tried to steal. Damian's legal advisor arrived with a slim laptop and a folder thick enough to look like a weapon. He didn't speak in dramatic warnings, only in careful facts. Dates that didn't align, signatures that didn't match, language that looked copied and pasted by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. The forged portion of the clause wasn't a mistake. It was a trick designed to corner Isabella and make her look unstable under pressure. Isabella listened, her fingers gripping the mug tighter, as every sentence confirmed what her heart already knew. They weren't trying to win fairly, they were trying to crush her quietly. Damian stood behind the advisor, arms folded, unreadable, but every so often his eyes narrowed the way they had at the party, like he was marking each lie for later. For the first time since the gold balloons and the wrinkled envelope, Isabella felt something she hadn't dared to feel, the shape of a way out. While the advisor explained next steps, Isabella's gaze drifted to the envelope Damian had placed on the counter, the same wrinkled thing that had started this storm. Something about it bothered her. The weight, the stiffness along the inside seam, as if the paper were hiding more than words. With permission, she took it and ran her fingers along the lining, slow and careful, and felt a slight bump where there shouldn't have been one. Her breath caught as she peeled it back gently, like opening a secret. A tiny folded note slipped into her palm, thin as a whisper, the ink smudged as if it had been handled in haste. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, and the message inside wasn't long, but it was enough to make her skin go cold. The note wasn't a threat, it was a warning, written by someone who sounded terrified of being discovered, someone inside the very circle trying to destroy her. Isabella's eyes lifted to Damian, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't calculation, a sharp, protective focus, like a guard dog hearing a sound in the dark. The advisor leaned in, reading over her shoulder, then looked up with a quiet seriousness that made the room feel smaller. "Your enemy is close," he said, "but so is your ally." Damian's phone buzzed with a new alert. Another move, another message, another pressure tactic, and Isabella realized hope didn't arrive as peace. Hope arrived as evidence, as small truths hidden in paper seams, as the first crack in a wall built to keep her powerless. The first headline hit the world before Isabella was ready to breathe normally again. It wasn't posted with kindness or context, just dropped like a match into dry grass. Damian Blackwood engaged, and beneath it, her name, her face captured in a blurry photo taken from too far away, as if she were a secret dragged into the light. Isabella stared at the screen in Damian's living room, the letters swimming for a moment, her coffee turning bitter in her mouth. She hadn't agreed to be famous, hadn't agreed to become a story people could chew and spit out. Outside the windows, the city moved on like nothing had happened, but inside her chest, everything tightened into a single question. How fast can strangers decide who I am? The storm came quickly, the way it always did when power felt threatened. Social comments poured in like poison, disguised as opinions, and within an hour an attorney's statement circulated. Polished words suggesting Isabella had targeted Damian, manipulated him, and chased money she didn't deserve. The tone was clean, almost charitable, which made it worse because it sounded like concern while it tried to ruin her. Isabella's fingers went cold around her phone as she read, not because she believed it, but because she recognized the tactic. Make her look greedy, unstable, opportunistic, then everything else becomes easier to take. Damian entered the room while she was still staring, and when he saw the headline, he didn't flinch. He only exhaled once, slow and controlled, like a man watching a predictable opponent make a predictable move. "They want you to panic," he said, and his voice wasn't comforting. It was instructive, steadying. He signaled his advisor, and within minutes the apartment filled with quiet movement. Calls made, documents assembled, timelines reviewed. Damian's team didn't respond with outrage. They responded with precision, releasing a short statement with clean facts and verified dates, then filing an immediate complaint about harassment and interference. The rival lawyer's polished smear was forced into the harsh light of scrutiny, where lies couldn't hide behind polite language. Isabella watched Damian work, and something in her shifted, because she realized he wasn't defending her to look noble. He was defending her because he refused to let a system be used like a weapon in the hands of people who thought they could do anything. But the more Damian countered, the more the invisible enemy revealed itself. The influential family, so careful to stay above scandal, began moving through quieter channels, pressuring contacts, calling in favors, stirring doubt behind closed doors. Isabella learned, piece by piece, that this family's reputation was built on controlling outcomes, not earning them, and that Damian's investments had once been part of their stability. Now, his presence beside her threatened their grip, and they were reacting like people who had never been told no. Isabella's phone buzzed again, and her breath caught when she saw the message. Anonymous, brief and deliberate, like a knife pressed against the skin. "Leave him, or you'll watch everything burn." She looked up at Damian, and for the first time she understood the truth beneath his calm. This wasn't just a fight for her survival anymore. This was a battle over who gets to decide a person's worth, and the next move would not be gentle. Isabella didn't open the anonymous message again, but it stayed inside her like a splinter. The penthouse felt safer than the world outside, yet the safety came with a new kind of pressure. Every window looked like it could be watched. Every phone buzz sounded like a hand reaching for her life. Damian's advisor spread documents across the table, and the paper smell mixed with the faint scent of coffee and expensive polish, creating a strange courtroom atmosphere in a home. Damian stood at the edge of it all, arms folded, eyes sharp, watching not only the facts, but Isabella herself, as if he knew she was holding something back. Isabella tried to keep her face steady, but her chest felt too full, like truth was pushing upward. She realized she couldn't let him fight a war for her without understanding what she was really protecting. "The person I love, the one they're using against me," Isabella said, voice low, "isn't a boyfriend. It's family." The words landed with a quiet heaviness, and for a moment the room felt still enough to hear her heartbeat. She explained the fragile reality she had hidden behind polite silence. Someone who depended on her stability, who couldn't survive another collapse, who had already lost too much. That was why the clause terrified her more than humiliation, more than gossip, more than poverty. It wasn't romance that was being stolen. It was her right to keep a life together with her own hands. Damian's gaze changed at that, not softening into pity, but sharpening into respect, the way a man looks at someone who has carried weight in silence for too long. The advisor pointed to the legal structure beneath the clause, and the true shape of the trap finally showed itself. It wasn't only a demand for marriage. It was tied to a trust and a guardianship arrangement, written in language that could be twisted to declare Isabella unstable if she appeared desperate, impulsive, or unsupported. If they succeeded, she could lose legal standing, rights that should never have been negotiable, and the people who depended on her could be taken from her through a clean, smiling process. Isabella's hands clenched at her sides as shame and fury rose together because she could suddenly see how carefully her fear had been engineered. Damian's jaw tightened and his voice came out like ice laid over fire. "They're not trying to take your money," he said. "They're trying to take your life apart and call it lawful." The advisor began combing through the envelope again, treating it like evidence, not paper. Isabella remembered the tiny hidden note, the warning from inside the enemy's circle, and she forced her mind to slow down, to notice what she had missed before. There was a coded line in the document, an odd reference, a number that didn't belong, a phrasing that looked ordinary until you read it twice. The advisor followed it like a trail, cross-checking filings, trust records, and board connections, and Isabella felt the room tighten as the truth took shape. Finally, the advisor circled a name on a printed ledger page and slid it across the table. Isabella stared at the underlined letters until they stopped looking like ink and started looking like a person. The name belonged to someone Damian trusted enough to sit at his own boardroom table. Damian didn't move at first, but the air around him shifted, as if the penthouse had suddenly become smaller than his anger. Isabella's stomach dropped, because betrayal at that level didn't just hurt, it destroyed foundations. Outside, the city continued shining like nothing had changed, but inside the room, everything had. Damian lifted his eyes to Isabella, and in that look was a warning and a promise at once. This wasn't going to end with a polite settlement. And as Isabella realized the enemy had been close enough to touch Damian's world from the inside, she understood that the next confrontation wouldn't be about saving face anymore. It would be about survival. The restaurant Damian chose didn't feel like a place for dinner. It felt like a stage built for judgment. The ceiling lights were warm, but the atmosphere was cold with quiet power, the kind that lived in tailored suits and practiced smiles. Isabella walked beside Damian with her shoulders back, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had already taken too much from her. She wore a simple, elegant dress, borrowed from the housekeeper's careful hands, and still she felt the old instinct to apologize for existing in a room like this. Damian didn't offer her his arm like a lover. He offered her his presence like a shield, steady and deliberate. When the hostess led them to the private table, Isabella saw them, members of the influential family, the rival lawyer, and the board member whose name had been circled like a wound. They stood as Damian approached, their smiles polished, their eyes sharp. The rival lawyer greeted Isabella first, voice sweet enough to sound harmless. "Miss Reyes," he said, as if her name were a minor detail in a larger story. "I hope you're feeling better after last night's confusion." Isabella felt the insult underneath the courtesy, the attempt to paint her as unstable without ever saying the word. She held her chin level and answered calmly, the way she did with cruel customers who expected her to flinch. "I'm feeling clear," she said, and the smallest pause followed, because they hadn't expected clarity. Damian's gaze moved across the table like a slow warning, and when he sat, the room seemed to settle into the gravity he carried. The family's spokesperson, an older woman with perfect jewelry and perfect posture, began speaking about concern and dignity, words that sounded gentle while they tried to tighten the rope. She suggested Isabella had been misled, that she should accept a quiet solution, that the public scandal could be avoided if Isabella simply stepped away. The rival lawyer nodded along, offering a folder like an olive branch, as if paperwork could replace truth. Damian didn't react until they finished, and that silence was more frightening than shouting. Then he placed his own folder on the table, opened it slowly, and slid out printed timelines, signature comparisons, and security logs that turned their polite story into something uglier. "You filed an emergency notice the same day you interfered with her phone," he said evenly, "and you used language that doesn't match the original trust documents." Isabella watched the smiles begin to crack, not dramatically, but in tiny flinches around the eyes. The rival lawyer tried to pivot, accusing Isabella of manipulation, hinting at greed, implying she had targeted Damian for escape. Isabella's stomach tightened, but she didn't lash out. She spoke softly, choosing dignity like a weapon they couldn't grab. "I have worked every day of my life," she said, voice steady. "And I asked for help because you cornered me, not because I wanted a prize." The older woman's gaze sharpened, as if she wanted to slice Isabella down with a look, but the room was changing, because truth spoken calmly is hard to paint as hysteria. Damian leaned forward slightly, and the light caught his cufflinks like small shields. "You're not negotiating with a frightened girl anymore," he said. "You're explaining fraud." The board member finally spoke, too quickly, too defensive, insisting everything was routine, that Damian was overreacting, that Isabella was a distraction. Damian's eyes locked onto him with a stillness that felt like winter. "Routine doesn't require forgery," Damian replied, and slid one final page forward, an internal record showing contact between the board member and the rival lawyer. The table went quiet in a way that made Isabella's skin prickle, because silence like that meant someone had been exposed. Damian's voice lowered, controlled, almost gentle, which made it worse. "You have one choice," he said to them all. "End this quietly and restore what you tried to steal, or I make sure the world sees exactly how you did it." And as Isabella felt every eye turned toward her, she realized the next move wouldn't only decide her freedom, it would decide what Damian was willing to burn to protect it. The silence after Damian's ultimatum didn't feel empty. It felt loaded, like a room holding its breath before something breaks. The older woman's smile stiffened, the rival lawyer's fingers tightened around his pen, and the board member's eyes darted the way guilty people glance toward exits. Isabella sat still, her hands folded in her lap, forcing her body to stay calm, even as her pulse pounded against her ribs. She could sense the calculation happening across the table, how to spin this, how to escape cleanly, how to turn her into the problem again. But the evidence Damian had placed on the table wasn't emotional, it wasn't messy. It was factual, dated, and sharp enough to cut through charm. For the first time since the gold balloons and the envelope, Isabella felt the ground hold steady beneath her. The rival lawyer tried first, choosing a tone of wounded professionalism. He spoke about misinterpretations, about procedural misunderstandings, as if forgery could be filed under human error. Damian let him finish, then slid one more page forward, an internal communication log that connected the lawyer to the board member with a trail too clean to deny. The board member's face drained slightly, a flicker of fear breaking through his practiced confidence, and the family's spokesperson turned her gaze on him with sudden, cold disgust, because betrayal is only tolerated until it becomes inconvenient. Damian's voice stayed quiet, but the authority in it filled the space like thunder held back. "You sold access," he said to the board member, "and you used her life as leverage to do it." Isabella felt something inside her unclench, not because it was over, but because the truth was finally standing up in the open. Within hours, the consequences moved faster than the cruelty ever had. Damian's legal team filed injunctions and emergency motions, freezing the predatory clause's enforcement and challenging the sudden inspection that had gutted Isabella's apartment. The forged portions were flagged, compared and documented with the kind of precision that made denial impossible, and the rival's public narrative began to collapse under its own weight. Isabella watched from the penthouse as notifications rolled in. Court acknowledgements, protective orders, statements corrected, each one a small brick removed from the wall built around her. The system that had felt untouchable suddenly looked human, flawed, and, when pushed by the right force, correctable. Isabella didn't celebrate. She simply sat down and breathed because she had forgotten what it felt like to inhale without drowning. That night, Damian found her near the windows, city lights softening into a quiet ocean below them. "The contract can end the moment you want it to," he said, and the words struck her harder than any threat because he offered freedom first, not ownership. Isabella turned to him slowly, feeling gratitude rise in her throat with a strange new fear, because gratitude could become attachment, and attachment could become heartbreak. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, and Damian's expression didn't soften, but something in his eyes did, something almost tired, almost honest. "I know," he replied, and that was the most unsettling part of all. Because as Isabella realized, the trap was breaking and her dignity was being returned piece by piece, a deeper question opened quietly inside her. What happens when the papers are no longer binding them and only the truth remains? Isabella didn't return to her old apartment, not the way a person returns home, because home had been handled by strangers and boxed like it was disposable. Instead, she went to the small place that mattered most, the quiet, modest house where the person she protected lived, where the air smelled like soap and warm food instead of marble and money. Damian came with her, not in a loud way, not for attention, but in the same steady silence he used when he wanted to understand what words couldn't explain. Isabella carried a simple bag in her hands, and the weight of it felt different now, less like desperation, more like choice. When the front door opened, the familiar face inside made her throat tighten, and for the first time in days, she felt something soften in her chest. She stepped forward carefully, as if sudden movements could scare the fragile peace away. Inside, the rooms were ordinary, worn furniture, family photos, a small kitchen table that had seen too many hard conversations. Isabella moved through the space as if she were reintroducing herself to her own life, setting down the bag, straightening a chair, making tiny repairs that looked meaningless to anyone else. The person she loved looked at her with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, the kind that comes from living too close to loss. Isabella didn't explain everything. She only promised stability with her presence, because that was the only language that mattered here. Damian remained near the doorway, respectful, quiet, eyes taking in the details that no headline could capture. The way Isabella's shoulders relaxed in this room, the way her voice warmed when she said simple things. In that small house, his wealth felt distant, almost useless, and for a moment he looked like a man discovering a kind of peace he couldn't buy. They sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, steam rising into the afternoon light. Isabella wrapped her hands around the mug and finally let herself look at Damian without the panic of survival between them. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude wasn't frantic anymore. It was steady, clean, and real. Damian's gaze held hers, and he didn't respond with charm or denial, only a quiet nod that said he accepted the truth without demanding anything back. For a brief moment, the world outside felt far away, and Isabella imagined a life where she didn't have to fight every day just to keep what she loved. It was a dangerous thought, soft, hopeful, and tender enough to hurt if it shattered. She lowered her eyes, because she didn't trust sweetness to last. That was when Damian's advisor called, his voice calm but edged with urgency. The forged clause had been halted, protections reinforced, and the board member removed. But one final hearing still remained, a last doorway the enemy could try to slam shut. Isabella listened, her fingers tightening around the mug, feeling the old fear creep back in like a shadow at sunset. Minutes later, a courier arrived at Damian's building with a sealed letter addressed to her, the paper thick and formal, the kind meant to look respectable while carrying poison. Isabella opened it slowly, reading each line as if her eyes could refuse what they saw. It was an offer to annul everything instantly. No more spotlight, no more conflict, no more danger if she agreed to testify against Damian and confirm the lie that she had manipulated him. Isabella's breath caught because the trap had changed shape, but it hadn't disappeared. And as she stared at the final sentence, she realized the cruelest part wasn't the threat. It was how gently they tried to dress betrayal as peace. The final hearing arrived with the kind of morning light that made everything look calmer than it truly was. Isabella sat beside Damian in a quiet courtroom, hands folded, spine straight, listening to her own heartbeat the way a person listens for thunder in the distance. The opposing side arrived with polished confidence, wearing smiles that suggested this would end the way they wanted. Quietly, neatly, with Isabella labeled as unstable and Damian painted as careless. Isabella felt the sealed letter in her memory like a stone, the offer of peace that demanded betrayal as its price. When the judge asked for clarity, Isabella didn't rush, didn't plead, didn't crumble. She spoke calmly, choosing truth the way some people choose faith, and the room shifted when it became clear she would not trade integrity for comfort. Damian's legal team presented the trail with patient precision. Signature comparisons, timelines, the interference attempts, the forged formatting, and the board members' connection that had already been exposed. The rival lawyer tried to reframe it as misunderstanding, but the judge's attention stayed fixed on the evidence, not the performance. Isabella's voice remained steady as she explained why she had been desperate and why desperation did not equal dishonesty. She did not dramatize the pain, she simply named it and named the love behind it. The kind of love that works double shifts and keeps promises even when no one applauds. The judge's ruling didn't come with theatrics, only firm finality. The predatory clause was dismantled, the forged sections recognized, and protective measures were made permanent. For Isabella, it felt like a door finally unlocking after years of turning the key in the wrong direction. Outside the courthouse, the air tasted different, colder, cleaner, more honest. The headlines still existed, but they no longer owned her, and the threats had lost the legal teeth they once carried. Damian turned to Isabella and spoke with the same restraint he'd shown from the beginning, but now his restraint felt like respect instead of distance. "The contract ends today," he said. "You're free." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, feeling gratitude rise again, quieter and deeper than before, because freedom offered without strings is rare in any world, rich or poor. She nodded, because she understood the gift beneath the words. He was giving her control back, the one thing her enemies had tried hardest to steal. Weeks later, Isabella returned to work, not because she had to, but because she wanted her life to feel like hers again. She rebuilt slowly, one simple day at a time, choosing peace the way she had once chosen survival. Damian stepped back from the spotlight, as he always had, but something in him had changed. He carried a softer patience now, as if he had finally learned that protection isn't possession, it's shelter offered with dignity. When they met, it wasn't with grand declarations, only with quiet understanding and the kind of honesty that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Isabella's heart didn't rush ahead anymore. It walked carefully, grateful for how far it had come. And when the city lights bloomed again at the edge of another midnight, they no longer looked like knives, only like stars that didn't belong to the rich alone. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption. Happy New Year, and may this new season bring you peace, courage, and gentle beginnings.